Are you seeking fulfillment for your life? Do you want freedom from fear? That's why we're here. Welcome to Jesus 101, introducing you to the real Jesus. And now, here's your host, Elizabeth Talbot.
Welcome to Jesus 101. Do you like my star? We just made it out of a paper plate, but I really like it. Actually, it's going to help us because today we are following the Magi as they followed the star, and we're going to try to understand a little bit more of what Matthew is saying of how God was guiding them towards Jesus, the King of the Jews. But actually, there are many more stops than what it looks like at first sight. As a matter of fact, their journey starts long time before Matthew. It starts in Genesis chapter 12. And let me tell you why. As we have said before, Matthew really is trying to tell us that all nations are included in the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is one of Matthew's favorite sentences. And he will say it more than 32 times in the gospel. You know, most of the Jews didn't say the name of God. So even though all the other gospels are talking about the kingdom of God, well, Matthew mainly talks about the kingdom of heaven. And in this case, the kingdom of heaven is for everyone. And Matthew has to break those news that, it includes everyone, including you and me. So many times he adds little verses here and there, like in the centurion's account, for example. Many of the Gospels actually record that. But Matthew says, well, they will come from the east and from the west, and they will sit down with Jacob at the table. Well, from the east came the Magi, but this was the covenant made with Abraham in chapter 12 of Genesis, verse 6. In this covenant, God has said to him, that this was the family of God that was starting, but that it would get really big because everyone was included in this blessing. And he said to them, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So the Magi are part of that family, and they come from the east. Now, the truth is, a lot of people think that this story of the Magi is made up. Only Matthew records it, and it's interesting that he's the only one that records these astrologers from the east coming following this star. We have several rules of historicity, we call them. And one of them is the rule of embarrassment. The first century church would never have made up a story that was so embarrassing to them. So when we find a spot that is embarrassing, we know it's true because they wouldn't have made it up. And the first century church really was against astrology and magicians, and they would have never invented such unworthy witnesses to the child Jesus. So here we have the Magi coming from the east. Let's start reading in chapter 2 of Matthew. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, okay, let's stop there for a moment. So the star actually had started with the promise of Abraham that there would be a blessing that would be greater than the Jews. It would be for all the nations, even those nations from the east. But then we're going to move this star to the part of the prophecy. Did you know there was a prophecy about a star? Well, let's go to that prophecy because now the star is moving with us even before we get to Matthew. The prophecy is in the book of Numbers. It's a strange little prophecy, but actually you probably know about the prophet that will utter it because we all have heard of Balaam. Remember the guy that talked to his donkey when he got angry? Well, Balaam was actually a Magi from the east. If you read the whole story of Balaam, chapter 22, 23, and 24 of the book of Numbers, you will see that he's also a wizard from the east. And Josephus calls him a magos, a magi, exactly like this people that came from the east. And actually the two stories are so similar. Balaam is hired by a wicked king to curse the people of God. Of course, you know the story of the Magi who are going to go to the king who wants to kill Jesus. Now, Balaam was paid to curse the people of God, but every time he uttered a prophecy, a blessing came. And in one of these prophecies, it talks about this star. So let's go to it. Chapter 24 of Numbers, verse 17. This is Balaam with his prophecy. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come forth from Jacob, and a scepter, or a ruler, you might say in your version, shall rise from Israel. Well, here it was. A wizard from the east came and gave a prophecy about Jesus, and a star that would rise from Jacob, and a ruler that would come from there. Now, a lot of people think that the Magi actually heard the prophecy of the star from Balaam, because he's also from the east. He's also a wizard. He's also an astrologer. You know, these astrologers were actually a priestly caste in Mesopotamian area. You know, whether it was Assyria or Babylonia, we have many of these Magi's in the Bible. Remember Daniel? He was called to be one of the group for Nebuchadnezzar. Well, they studied many things. They studied the heavens and they studied scriptures, the Jewish scriptures included. Now, they didn't have the full light. There's no doubt about that, because they didn't know he would be born in Bethlehem. So perhaps they didn't fully understand yet, but they had enough light to know that there would be a star. So they were looking up into the sky, and that's where God met them. You know, for me, it's very interesting that God communicates with us where we're looking. I know that you've been told that God perhaps only talks in the Bible or only in a particular way. Well, I don't think so. God used to talk to Pharaoh. He used to talk to Nebuchadnezzar. He talked to a lot of people that were not the people of God in the Bible. And yet he found a way to communicate with them. So this star that we're following, that we're starting to follow in Matthew chapter 2, actually started before. Started in the promise of Abraham, that actually all the nations and the people of the world would be blessed. And then it went on to a prophecy, Balaam's prophecy, a star will come from Jacob. Wouldn't you like to have a star in your own life? Well, you will see that if we follow this star, at the end of the journey that we're going to see in all three segments, actually the star goes all the way to the cross. And that is a long journey, isn't it? But actually, all of our journeys are aiming the same place. Because you see, we go through several stages in our journeys. Yes, sometimes all we have is a promise from God. Sometimes we find ourselves perhaps with a promise that looks or feels like a prophecy for our lives. We know where we're heading. We get glimpses of our gifts, of our journeys. But let me tell you, our star will always guide us to the cross, because God has a Ph.D. in communication. Yeah, He really does. And He's going to communicate with you and guide you in the place where you're looking. He's really wanting to communicate with you. Perhaps this is not going to be a star. Perhaps it's going to be a different way. But God wants to let you know that He is looking out for you, that He has a plan for you, that He knows who you are, and He knows where you're looking. So perhaps the story of the Magi will give you great encouragement that God is with you and that He actually wants to guide you.
You're watching Jesus 101.
Welcome to Jesus 101. We're still with my paper plate star, the one I really like, because this is helping us to realize how is it that God guides us in our journeys. I think most of us would love to have a star that guides us. Wouldn't you like one? Wouldn't you like to have a star that when you're wondering, okay, what should I do now? Actually stops and says, this is the one you have to choose. This is the job you should go to. Well, we were talking about Matthew 2, and we started with the fact that, well, it started with the promise back in Genesis chapter 12, when God said to Abraham that all the nations of the world, not just the Jews, would be blessed through his descendant. And of course, the Magi were from the east, and they were coming from far away from Jerusalem. And they saw a star. Now, there had been a prophecy in previous segment, we talked about Numbers chapter 24, when Balaam, remember Balaam, the one that talked to the donkey? He actually was also a wizard from the east, and also was hired by a king to do bad to the people of God. But every time he would open his mouth, well, a nice blessing would come out. Well, he had a prophecy of a star that would rise from Jacob, from Israel. And of course, a lot of people think that the Magi have heard about this prophecy from Balaam, because they were from the east as well, and they were also Magi. Well, the star continues, and we get to Matthew 2. This is when the Magi are actually following the star. Well, when they get to Jerusalem, there's quite a paradox. Well, of course, they thought that when they got there, everybody would be waiting. They had come from afar. And everybody should have been waiting, right? Because now we are in territory that this king was going to be born. And we have here what happened in this paradoxical time of their journey. And by the way, do you know? Most of us have a paradoxical time in our journey when we don't fully understand how things connect. When we think it was going to be one way, and when we get there, it wasn't. And perhaps you who are watching us today are going through that paradoxical stage in the journey of life. But don't despair. God is even guiding you through this time. So when they get there, verse 2 of chapter 2 of Matthew, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? This is the first time we hear this title, King of the Jews. And it's uttered by people that are not Jews. And they say why they're asking. We saw his star. So remember the prophecy of the star? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. They immediately say why they've come. Of course, it was a known custom that if a new ruler came, sometimes caravans from the east would come to congratulate them for their new appointment. We have some of that in history for other emperors. But these people have come to worship him, not just to congratulate him. Verse 3, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. What a paradox. People from the east coming to worship. Herod, that is right there, just troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Now, he gathers everybody that knows the scriptures. Because, see, the Magi didn't have the whole light. They had a little bit of light. They just knew there was going to be a star. Many times God guides you through many different venues. Usually, he takes you directly to the scriptures eventually for the rest of the story. And so here we have in verse 4, he gathered everybody, the chief priests and everyone, and he asked where the Messiah would be born. See, I want to point this out. Messiah, the anointed one that they were waiting for, Herod knew that they were talking about him. He doesn't say King of the Jews because, of course, he's the King of the Jews. So this becomes a tale of two kings in a very paradoxical way. And they tell him in Bethlehem. And they quote a prophecy, Micah 5:2. Micah 5:2 says, "O you, Bethlehem, the least of Judea." But, Matthew can't say the least because Jesus was born there. So he actually turns it to the opposite. And here it says, chapter 2, verse 6, "You, Bethlehem, by no means the least." So he puts it opposite to what the prophecy was. But he says, this is the place where the Messiah would be born. And it goes like this. Let me read the whole verse 6. "And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah. For out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Of course, we had been waiting for the shepherd the whole history of the world. The Davidic king that was to come. Remember, David was a shepherd who became a king. And this was the king that was coming that would shepherd the people of God. There are many interesting things about this narrative that we might not have time to go through. But even the introduction of the city of Bethlehem in the first verse of this chapter, Bethlehem of Judea. There were many Bethlehems in the time of Jesus and many ways to differentiate them between, themselves. But he wants to say Judea because the Bethlehem of Judea is the one where Davidic kings come from, and Judea is the territory of the kings, and this is a tale of two kings. Now, the Magi don't understand why, if this star has been traveling for so long, when they get to Jerusalem, nobody's worshiping. As a matter of fact, not only are they not worshiping, but Herod is going to tell them to find out where is this king of the Jews, because, well, he says, I want to worship him too. And you almost see that with a wink. Really? You want to worship him? Well, we know that that is not true, because the fourth event narrated on Jesus' infancy is the slaughter of all the babies in Bethlehem by Herod, trying to exterminate the Messiah. Well, I really wanted to stop here in the paradox for a while with you. I know that many of us would love to have a star that guides us. I remember being younger and asking God, is there any sign you can show me? If this is the way or that is the way. A star would be nice. Well, God guides us through the paradoxical times in our lives. Yes, we are guided by promises and we are guided by prophecies, but even through paradoxical times we are guided. And of course, when the Magi arrived to Jerusalem and they found this paradox, they were kind of, well, disappointed, the way that you might be if you're in a paradoxical time right now. But in the middle of their disappointment, they come out and they see the star again. You know, Herod couldn't help them much because he didn't want to worship. They come out, they understand it's Bethlehem, they're heading that way, but they saw the star once again and they were overjoyed. God guides us in our journeys, in the good times and in the bad times. He guides us when we are so sure, and He guides us when we're not so sure. He guides us when we are in paradoxical times and a little bit of confusion. Actually, He said, I am with you always, to the very end of the age. Remember Emmanuel? Well, He's with us when things are shining and when they're a little dark.
You're watching Jesus 101.
Welcome back to Jesus 101. I'm still here with my paper plate star. You know, in Argentina, Uruguay, and some other Latin American countries, we celebrate Epiphany, which is on January 6th. Well, this particular feast was celebrated here in the West before even Christmas was, because it celebrates the time when the Gentiles were exposed to the gospel. Remember our little journey with the Magi? Well, the Magi had started way before they even knew they had started. It had started back in Genesis with the promise that all nations would be blessed. And then the prophecy of Balaam. Balaam was a wizard from the east who uttered a prophecy in the book of Numbers, chapter 24, that a star would rise in Israel and a ruler will come from there. So the Magi were looking at the skies, and that's when they saw the star. When we get to Jerusalem, which we did in our last segment, they find a paradox. They're asking for the king of the Jews, but there is already a king of the Jews. His name is Herod, and he's not liking this very much. So what he does, he wants to find out where this child king is so that he can kill him. But of course, they don't know that. Now, when they leave Herod, they're going to see the star again. And we're going to go to the most joyful stage of this journey when they're going to bring gifts to Jesus Christ, which will become the provision for Joseph, Mary, and Jesus for the next few years they're going to spend in Egypt. See, Joseph and Mary didn't have any money, but God has told them that, well, this is His child, and He's going to take care of it, even when they don't fully understand how. Can you imagine God showing the star and planning this whole thing back from Numbers 24 so that somehow this Magi from the east could come and give these gifts so that Joseph, Mary, and Jesus would have something to eat while they were in Egypt? I am amazed in the way God plans to provide for us. He has 1,000 ways to provide that we don't know anything about. And in this case, well, He planned to give them gifts, and these gifts were very expensive. But these gifts were given because the Magi had come to worship. Why don't we read this part? This is a joyful part of this journey. Let's do 8. Chapter 2, verse 8 in Matthew. And He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child, and when you have found him, report to me so that I too may come and worship him." Right? Well, verse 9, after hearing the king, they went their way, and the star, which they had seen in the east, went on before them until it came and stood over the very place where the child was. Verse 10, when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. By now you know that the word great in Greek is mega. When they realized that they really were arriving to worship this child king, they overjoyed with mega joy. Verse 11, after coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell to the ground and worshipped him. Look what they gave him. Opening their treasures, they presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. You know, a lot of people see in these 3 gifts typological gifts. You know, gifts that not only are going to give them money and provision, but that are symbols of who Jesus was. They say gold is for the King of Kings, and frankincense is for the priest of priests, and myrrh is for the sacrificial lamb. So here they give him typological gifts that will provide for the next few years in Egypt. And verse 12, having been warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi left for their own country by another way. I think it's so interesting how our journeys develop. How is it that God guides us? Perhaps He starts with a promise, or perhaps a prophecy is what guides us. Sometimes we go through paradoxical times. And the truth is, He gives us His provision, and sometimes in a way that we don't fully understand. We were expecting something. I'm sure Joseph and Mary maybe were expecting, I don't know, a job of carpentry so that Joseph could pay for this way to Egypt later. But God sends the Magi from the east with gold, frankincense, and myrrh. You know, God wants to communicate with you too. There's enough stars to go around for you and for me, because God does want to guide all of us in our own journey. Now, here's a little piece of information that it might be interesting to you. Remember the title that the Magi called Jesus? King of the Jews? King of the Jews? Where is the King of the Jews? Well, do you know that the star is going to lead us all the way to the cross in the Gospel of Matthew? Because the title, King of the Jews, is not going to reappear in the Gospel of Matthew until chapter 27, when Jesus will be crucified. No one else from the Magi to Pilate calls Jesus King of the Jews. So come with me to chapter 27, and it's very interesting that this title is only uttered by Gentiles in the whole Gospel of Matthew, whether Magi at the beginning or Pilate at the end. And actually, Jesus dies with this charge, that He was in fact the King of the Jews. You know, Jesus dies with a treason charge. The Romans kill Him because He said He was a king, and there was only one king, Caesar, right? So He dies because of treason. And the charge was always placed on top of the cross. And in His case, the charge for which He was dying was King of the Jews. So even though the star started in Genesis 12:3, when we know that all nations are included and the Magi from the east are part of all the nations. And then it continued to the prophecy of Balaam They said a star would rise, and Balaam was from the east, so perhaps that's how the Magi heard about the prophecy. But then they came to Jerusalem, and they found a paradox, like many times we do in our own journeys. They don't understand what's going on. They thought they were going to find something. They find something else. Jerusalem is troubled instead of celebrating. And then God uses them to provide for Jesus for the next few years of his infancy that are going to be spent in Egypt because Herod wants to kill him. So a dream will be used again by God to say to Joseph, well, go to Egypt because Herod wants to kill the boy. By then they have gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and they will have enough provision. But the truth is, all of our journeys always bring us to the cross because it is the King of the Jews who would die, the ones that the Magi were asking for. I wish for you and I pray for you that your journey is taking you to the foot of the cross. Whatever stage you're in, even if it's the paradoxical stage, I pray that the star has really guided you right here, to the place where the King of the Jews died.